Welcome to Sitting with Sallie. Today my guest is Braden Murray, Curator of the Muse Lake of the Woods Museum. Welcome, Braden.
Good morning.
And I think we're going to have fun today because we are going to be talking about the Christmas tree and its history and the Santa Claus Parade.
Absolutely.
Before we do, though, I'd like to get a bit more about your background as curator and historian.
Sure. So growing up, I grew up in the Maritimes, and my family, we spent a lot of time on vacation, going to museums all around the Maritimes, Louisbourg and coal mines and Halifax, all sorts of really great historical institutions. So I come by it honestly, as they say.
There's a lot of history in the East.
Indeed, there certainly is. So after I finished university, I was looking for work, and I found it here. So I loaded up my car and off I went. So I've been with the Muse for 12 years. And recently we were the Lake of the Woods Museum, and now we have the Douglas Family Arts Center. And so those two entities form the Muse.
Good partnership.
Indeed.
And I know one of the jobs that you took over a few years ago is the cemetery tours.
Indeed. So the cemetery tour has been running for about 20 years or so. And it was always kind of based on some personal interests of city staff and these sorts of things. When those people retired, it was passed down the line to tourism and then to us. And so I've been running the museum, or rather the cemetery tour for the museum for the last 5 years.
And I love going on them, but we're now in winter, so
Indeed. Indeed.
Way before the Christmas tree started, I think you were telling me before that Kenora got into Christmas in a big way.
Yeah, so there was certainly Christmas traditions, and when we think about Christmas now, we immediately go to Santa Claus. But for many, many years, the Christmas tree, the Tannenbaum, that was the way to celebrate Christmas. So Rat Portage is what Kenora used to be called, and through the 1880s and 90s, Rat Portage would be decorated with trees down Main Street, and so the trees would kind of line Main Street and 2nd Street and just kind of give a festive air. Obviously no electric lights at that point, but the decoration was in full swing, certainly. People were very keen.
And you have a photo showing that, and when you had mentioned that before, I assumed the trees would be decorated somehow.
Yeah, so they weren't decorated as we would know them today. They were very much just trees that were cut in the forest and brought out and set up on Main Street. So it would have smelled great, certainly. And it would have been just really, really nice decoration, I think. It would have been quite pleasant.
As well as the trees, a lot of the businesses and hotels also got into decorating?
They did. So the idea of a Christmas dinner at the idea of a Christmas dinner at a hotel was very common in the 1890s and turn of the century. There was a lot of people here for work, for gold mines and the lumber industry. And if their family wasn't here, if they were here by themselves, there would be this great feast, these banquets at the local hotels, at the Hilliard House, at the Commercial Hotel, later the Kenora Hotel. Lots of Christmas cheer to be had, certainly.
And the dining was very formal, white tablecloths, white napkins.
It was. So what started out as something more akin to what you'd see at a lumber camp was a little more rowdy in the 1890s. We, at the museum, have programs from the 1890s that even go so far as having tables of people who are, during the boundary dispute for Ontario versus Manitoba, sort of, keep them separate for when the eggnog starts to flow. But by the turn of the century and by the early 1900s, the setting was very fancy, very white tablecloth, waiters with white coats and these sorts of things, very prim and proper.
And one of the hotels, the Hilliard House, started around 1893, and it has a bit of a history to it.
It does, yeah. So it started even just a little bit before that, but it was seen as the premier hotel in town. So in the image of the decorated downtown, the Hilliard House takes center stage. There's a crowd. We're not sure what the crowd is doing. They're milling about. But the decorations are up in full swing. And the Hilliard House was really the hotel of record in town. For those who are not familiar, the Hilliard House sat on the property that's now occupied by the Kenora. And so the Hilliard House unfortunately burned down in 1902.
It was all wooden.
It was. It was all wooden, and there was some sort of incident in the kitchen that caused the building to burn. So it took out the Hilliard House and also directly beside it the Queen's Hotel. So that patch of land that the Kenora now sits on was formerly the Queen's and Hilliard House.
And what did it become the Kenora right away, or was there another hotel there?
So it burned in 1902, and there was an empty lot there until 1907. 1907 is when the kind of initial construction of the Kenora started. It did take a little bit of time. There was some construction delays and these sorts of things. But by 1910, the Kenora was ready to go. So.
And when did the Christmas tree first come into being?
Well, the Christmas tree comes a little bit later. So the Christmas tree, well, I should backstep. So the Rotary Club, everyone knows the Rotary Club. They're still kind of going strong 100 years later. The Rotary Club throughout the 1920s had huge concerts at Derry's Palace Theatre. So Derry's Palace Theatre was on the current site of what's now Nietzsche Friendship Center and the current theatre. So it was a large Victorian vaudeville hall. And they would have these great Christmas concerts, and they'd have singers and dancers and carols, and it was a fundraiser for the Children's Aid Society. Well, throughout the 1920s, early 1930s, that decoration, people were coming to the Palace Theatre just to see the decorations. Yeah. And the owner, Joseph Derry, thought this is a really great thing to spread Christmas cheer. Now in 1932, we were in the depths of the Great Depression. The Great Depression hit this area very hard. Manufacturing, lumbering, everything. The mill was shut down. It was a very tough time.
So you're talking about 1929 is when it started?
1929 is when it really started here. And honestly, it didn't take very long for the effects to be really felt.
Because the mill shut down, that meant the lumber camp shut down.
That's right. And so there was a knock-on effect throughout town. All of the supporting industries, all of the raw materials, everything was just stopped. And it was a very difficult time for town.
And there was nowhere else for men to go and find work. That would be part of a problem too.
Well, that's it. So we didn't have the sort of mobility that we have now. One of the large places that men were finding work was in the highway construction camps. So between the federal government and the provincial government in 1932, that's when they built the road from the Manitoba border to about Ignace or so about 160 miles. And in that stretch, there was 18 camps where men would have about a 10-mile stretch or so, and they were building the highway. And so the highway, when it opened in 1932, it's quite unique in Canada because we can put almost to the minute when general sort of mass tourism started in this area. The first weekend that was opened was the May Long weekend in 1932. And in that weekend, there was 5,000 cars that traveled across the Manitoba border to Kenora.
Oh my goodness.
5,000.
Wow.
That's considerably more cars than there were people here in town. And so that's why you start to see a lot of the hotels and a lot of the motels and cottages and these sorts of things built in the 1930s.
So when the camps came into being, the men lived in camps, worked on the highway there, but it didn't just attract people from Kenora and area.
That's right. So they attracted people from across Ontario. And I went into a bit of a digression there, but the highway camps were the local media was very keen to show that men were having great Christmas meals, great Christmas celebrations, Christmas trees, forming hockey teams, and having a great time at these camps. It would have been a very difficult time because it meant dad was away for Christmas, trying to raise money for the family, working in these camps. And for people who lived in Kenora, there was no way, even if the camp was 20 miles away, there was no kind of quick way to go back and forth. And so it was in the winter of 1932, men were in these highway construction camps celebrating Christmas away from their families.
Okay. We're going to take a short break, and then we'll go back. You were talking about when the first Christmas tree started happening, so we'll come back to that.
Absolutely.
Please join us in a moment. Welcome back to Sitting with Sallie. Just before the break, we were talking about Joseph Derry and Derry Theatre and how much Mr. Derry just went all out for Christmas.
Absolutely. So just kind of setting the scene, 1931-32, we're in the heights of the Great Depression. And Joseph Derry, he was a showman, he owned a theater, he understood kind of panache. And he was noticing in 1932 that people were coming to his theater just to see the decorations. And with Christmas in town, things were starting to look up a little bit, but it was still the Great Depression. And he had this great idea where he would purchase a large tree and set it up as the community tree in the downtown. And so he went to other businesses in town and asked them to donate. He went to other businesses in town and asked them to decorate as well. And he encouraged other businesses in town to hire out-of-work laborers to help decorate for Christmas. So he put up this great Christmas tree at the center of Main and 2nd Street in that intersection, right beside what was then the Imperial Bank and is now the Vault Social House.
And what year was that the Christmas tree went up?
So that was 1932.
Oh.
So 1932, the Depression is still ongoing, but we're starting to see a little bit of glimmer of hope. And it became the first community tree. So now we're in year 91 of the community Christmas tree.
Since then, yes. So the first year, it was a big tree.
It was,
Yep.
absolutely.
And was it decorated?
So it would have not have been decorated as we know it now. So it wouldn't have had electric lights, for example. There was electricity in town. That wasn't the case. But at the time, it was, we don't know exactly what it was decorated with, but it's very possible that it just didn't have any decorations on it. It's also possible that maybe it had paper decorations or ceramic, plastic, these sorts of things. But the way we know it now with the lit up tree came a little bit later. So that came a few years after.
And did it immediately become an annual?
It did actually. So it was very popular. So not just the tree being decorated, it meant all of downtown was really getting into the spirit. Businesses were decorating themselves, encouraged to hire people to do it. And it became the cornerstone of the downtown decorations.
And would they have been as large as the trees are today?
About as large, yeah. So 25, 30 feet, quite large trees. So we know that in 1936, it was so large that they had to hire they asked the town of Kenora crew, the hydro crew, to set up the tree. They had their bucket trucks and their ladders and the expertise. And that's when you start to see the electrified tree that we would know today.
And where did the trees come from?
The trees came from all around town. So sometimes they would be identified by hydro crews. They would say, hey, there's a great tree in this location. Let's keep that in mind. But I know the town starts to look for its Christmas tree in August every year.
Oh.
It's quite a process. A couple of years ago, community volunteer Tom Mashura donated the tree. He had actually planted the tree specifically for that purpose about 30 years ago. So amazing foresight there, and someone who truly loved the community.
And that was the tree for 2020, I think.
That was the tree for 2020. Yeah.
And they look for the tree in August.
Mm-hmm.
How far ahead do they cut the tree for it to come into town?
So they start to look for the tree in August. They identify it in September and October. They cut the tree on the morning that it moves to the downtown location. So when they did the revitalization of Main Street in 2010, they actually built a manhole into the street specifically for the tree to slot into. So it's got sort of a concrete base. I talked to the engineer. I talked to Marco, and he explained that it's got a concrete base where they parade the tree down with an OPP escort, and they take a crane and they put that guy up and drop it down to the manhole into this concrete base.
A big tree stand.
And essentially a big tree stand. That's absolutely right. So, yeah, really kind of a neat thing.
And the tree usually goes up the third week in November, but it doesn't get lit up then.
That's right. So it goes up, it's ready to go, and there is a tree lighting ceremony. So we've had to take a pause on that the last couple of years. We've done it digitally. We've sort of done it in other ways. But this year they're inviting the crowd back down for the tree lighting ceremony on Friday, November 19th. So it should be pretty exciting.
It should be, yes. And I've seen it. It's a big tree this year too.
It is.
Once again.
It's a good looking tree.
It's good.
And it's nice to decorate the downtown in that way. So there's no way to miss it. it's so central, and you're coming, especially when you're coming around Lakeview Drive and you turn at the City Hall. It's right there, right in front of you.
The best time is just before it gets really dark and you can see the tree all lit up at the end of the street, and it bit of snow coming down really brings a feeling of Christmas.
It does. It's quite lovely. Absolutely.
Now, the tree that Mr. Derry put up is not in the same location as the tree is today.
That's right. So at that point, the tree was basically in the center of the intersection of 2nd and Main. That would be an issue today. It would essentially turn it into a traffic circle. And especially when you consider how large the tree is, some bigger trucks would have a hard time getting through. And so as early as 1939, you can see the location of the tree was actually kind of brought back. The Trans-Canada Highway, as many remember, used to go right through downtown Kenora. And as a consequence, there were semi-trucks and there was all sorts of large equipment. And I mean, it was quite busy. So the tree was moved back and has been sitting in the location it currently sits in for many years.
And it's hard to imagine, but a Christmas tree would cause controversy. But you were telling me before, in the 1980s, there was a controversy about the Christmas tree.
There was. So between 1978 and 1986, there was the Harbourfront revitalization, the Harbourfront program where they got rid of the old boathouses and built up the Harbourfront. And in 1986, that project was completed. And at the time, there was a thought among some in the city government, some elected leaders, thought it would be a good idea to take the tree from Main Street and put it on the new Harbourfront. They loved the idea of people caroling around the tree. They were quite keen on this idea. And they thought that would be great. And people were, they were outraged, quite frankly. It was quite controversy.
Don't move our tree.
That's right. So the plan was hatched. They let the public know, and immediately there was backlash. People loved the tree on Main Street. Eventually, there was a compromise reached where they maintained the tree on Main Street, but also had a tree on the Harbourfront, where they did do the caroling. But that lasted a few years, and eventually it kind of fizzled out. And
I suspect the Harbourfront tree wasn't quite as big.
well, I think that's the case. It was second fill to the main event, I think.
So overall, what do you think the Christmas tree means to Kenora residents?
It's a symbol of Christmas, certainly. It's a symbol of a time of year. And for a lot of people who grew up in Kenora, many people either leave for work or family reasons, or they moved here for a few years and they're coming back and they're here to visit at Christmas time. So it represents Christmas, certainly. It also represents a time of year, represents togetherness. It represents family fun around Christmas. And it represents sort of a time period. So there's this great feeling that it evokes where you can be 80, 90 years old and you think, when I was a kid, that's where the Christmas tree was.
I was going to say, if you're coming back, it will bring back memories of childhood for
Absolutely.
sure. Yes.
And it's something that as a culture, as a people, we're so deprived of tradition and sort of kind of things that bring us together. So when you have something that goes back as far as the Main Street tree does, it's really quite, it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting
A thread that connects through the generations.
That's right. Absolutely. It's something that connects everyone.
So we're going to take another short break, and when we come back, we'll talk about the Santa Claus Parade. So join us then. Welcome back to Sitting with Sallie. My guest today is Braden Murray of the Muse Lake of the Woods Museum, and we're going to be talking about the Santa Claus Parade. I'm assuming that it's of similar age to the Christmas tree.
It is. So many of the traditions that we have here in town, we can trace directly back to the Great Depression. And so there were Santa events, there was Santa kind of one-offs and lots of different things, even as far back as the 1910s, during the First World War and that sort of thing. But the direct line that we can trace back to the Santa Claus Parade goes to 1934.
Before we get there to the parade, let's go back to World War I and
Sure.
what was going on.
Yeah, so there was a lot of soldiers who had children, and the YMCA and the British Empire Service League, which became the Legion, and other organizations would have events for kids. They would sponsor events for kids, for soldiers, children, where Santa Claus would come and he would distribute gifts and baubles and various things. And that was a pretty popular thing that kind of went throughout the First World War into the 1920s, and always at the YMCA, which is now currently the Legion building.
And Santa would come to these events?
Indeed, Santa would make an appearance, and the kids would love it, and he would hand out toys and gifts and all sorts of goodies.
And how did Santa get to town?
Well, in 1934, they said that Santa would arrive in town by a ski plane. So the story in 1934 was that Santa would be arriving on Christmas Eve by ski plane in the north of town, and then he would load onto a dog sled, and he would drive down to the fire hall where the Christmas feast was going on.
And that's on 2nd Street?
The 2nd Street, currently the brewing company. And so they would go on 2nd Street, and Santa would be there, and people should watch out for Santa. Now, it was either it didn't go how they planned, or it was considerably more successful than they anticipated, because they had over 1,000 kids show up. And so the kids lined the streets. They saw Santa going on this dog sled, and he arrived at the fire hall, went inside, and the kids were, chanting for Santa, and it was really quite the thing. And he actually had to come back outside and address the crowd and sort of thank them for coming and hand out various things. The event was to work with the Children's Aid Society and the firefighters, the Kenora Fire Brigade, Toys for Tots program, the Salvation Army. They were delivering Christmas hampers to various families around town.
And they didn't have enough presents for 1,000 kids.
Well, that's right. So they realized their error, I think, fairly quickly.
How do you send 1,000 angry kids home?
Well, that's it. So they gave away as many presents as they had, and as many kind of toys and candies and nuts and sweets and various things. And everyone enjoyed it. Everyone had a good time. Everyone liked to see Santa Claus. So the next year, they were very keen to make sure that the crowd was a little bit more separated. And so again, it was on Christmas Eve, December 24th, and they gave a timetable. They said Santa would be arriving in Keewatin at about 3 o'clock. He would be arriving in Norman at about 3:50 or so, and he would be arriving in Kenora at about 5 o'clock.
And this was still by dog sled?
This was still by dog sled, although this time he was being accompanied by the OPP. So this is the sort of the proto Santa Claus Parade, because people lined the streets. Santa gave away fruits and nuts and kind of other things. And it was a little bit more of what we would recognize as a parade. He still went to the fire hall, went to the Christmas feast for the Children's Aid Society with the fire brigade, and then they loaded up a couple trucks and they drove around town and delivered Christmas hampers to various families. So that was sort of the beginning of what we would know as the modern parade. And
that was still during the Depression then?
It was. Yep. So things were still very tough here in town. The volunteers with, like I said, the Children's Aid Society, the Salvation Army was very active as well. The Kenora Fire Brigade with their Toys for Tots program, their Empty Stocking Fund, as it would later be known. Very, very important in making sure that everyone had a Merry Christmas.
And I'm assuming it evolved from just Santa on dog sled to incorporate floats at some point?
Well, it did. So Santa on a dog sled eventually was, like I said, accompanied by the OPP, and then other community groups said, well, if Santa's going, we should go with him. So it evolved sort of organically in that way. So through the 1930s and into the early 1940s, you see sort of what we would recognize as a Santa Claus Parade. They would move the time back to early December. So for the first few, it was always on December 24th. Eventually, they separated the two events. So you would have the parade, and then you would have the Children's Aid Society feast and things at the fire brigade. So eventually they were separate, but throughout the late 1930s, that's when you see the separation.
And then during the 1940s, the early 40s, it was during the war.
Mm-hmm. So during the war is when you start to see many more floats, patriotic floats, of course, community groups. That's when the kinsmen were really got involved. The kinsmen were responsible for the kin cow. And people say, oh, is that like a paper mache cow? No, that's a real cow.
It's a real cow being pulled down the street.
That's right. So they had a couple, literally cowboys, who were riding horses, and they had this cow. And the whole point was to raise nickels and dimes to buy milk for the children of England. This was during the Second World War. Rationing was strictly enforced, and they understood that milk was important for the development of young boys and girls. And so the kinsmen were very keen on making sure that young boys and girls were able to get their milk. So the kin cow was an important part of that.
And do you know how long they had the cow as part of the parade?
Well, they had the cow as long as a parade for the duration of the war, certainly. I don't know how long the cow lasted after the war. I mean, rationing in the UK lasted into the 50s, so it's certainly possible. But the emphasis on the kin cow was really, really high in the 1940, 41 sort of age. By the late 1940s, after the Second World War, soldiers were returning home. That's when you start to see the Santa Claus Parade really take off as an event. Certainly it was important during the war, but with the baby boom, lots of young kids, lots of new families, lots of floats. The Santa Claus Parade used to be on Saturday mornings, so sort of in lieu of cartoons, in lieu of sort of the going to the theater. That was the event.
And you had told me earlier that you could get a sense of the economy by how many floats were at a parade.
That's absolutely right. So you can kind of see if things are going well in town, then the parade is quite large. There's lots of candy being thrown. There's lots of good floats, these sorts of things. It's definitely an economic marker for sure.
And does anything stand out for you for the weather for some of the parades?
Some of the parades you look at, some of them, it's kind of bizarre when there's no snow. So you look back through some of the older photos, there are a few that there's no snow, it's kind of bleak looking. But generally Kenora, we know, as we've seen in the last few weeks, generally there's a good patch of snow by the time the Santa Claus Parade rolls around. So certainly, it's a bit cold sometimes. I know I've been bundled up quite.
It's the wind that gets you.
It is the wind that gets you, absolutely. So sometimes it's nice to tuck yourself in a little alcove or around a corner of a building.
And you'd mentioned to me earlier about an 1898 newspaper in which there was an opinion editorial complaining about how commercial Christmas was getting.
Absolutely. So going back and looking at the advertisements, the idea of Christmas kind of starting in November like we have now, it's kind of a new tradition. I will say I'm guilty of this. I've got a Christmas tree up in my house, and my wife and I quite enjoy it, and the cat is hitting the ornaments on the bottom of the tree. But even as far back as 1898, people were complaining, the commercialism of Christmas. This is a family tradition, and it shouldn't be about buying things. It should be about togetherness, which is true. It's 100% true. But it's the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Thank you.
Certainly.
Quite fascinating. And thank you for watching. I hope you'll join us again.